The 30th of December, 1916. The Moika Palace stands as a tomb against the frozen Neva River. Inside, the air is heavy with the cloying, sharp scent of bitter almonds. Prince Felix Yusupov grips the handle of his revolver beneath the table, his knuckles drained of color. Across from him, Grigory Rasputin sits in the dim light. His pale, piercing eyes remain fixed on a plate of cakes. The conspirators watch from the shadows, their breath held, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Rasputin lifts a piece of pastry to his lips. He chews slowly. He swallows. He reaches for another. The silence in the room stretches, thin and brittle. Yusupov stares, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The peasant finishes the plate, wipes his fingers, and leans back. A low, raspy sound begins in his throat, a laugh that carries no warmth. He gestures toward the empty bottle. "More wine!" he demands. The poison that should have stopped a heart has done nothing. Rasputin's gaze drifts toward the shadows, his expression unreadable. Yusupov could wait no longer. He stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. The revolver cleared his pocket, the metal cold and heavy. He did not hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence, a thunderous crack that filled the room with acrid smoke. Rasputin jerked backward, his chest blooming with a dark stain. He slumped, hitting the floor with a heavy final thud. Yusupov stepped forward, his breath hitching, his hands trembling as he leaned down to confirm the end. The room remained deathly still. Then, the impossible happened. A hand, thick and calloused, shot up from the floor. It clamped onto the prince's throat with the force of a vice. Yusupov choked, his heels digging into the rug as he was hauled downward. Rasputin rose, his body surging with a raw, unnatural vitality. His eyes were wide, burning with a frantic, animal intensity. He did not speak. He simply lunged, his fingers digging into the prince's skin, dragging him toward the door. The conspirators scrambled from the shadows, chairs toppling, shouts erupting in the confined space. The murder had failed. The struggle for the palace had begun. The struggle spilled out of the palace and into the biting night air. Rasputin stumbled, his movements erratic, his strength finally waning under the weight of multiple impacts. The conspirators swarmed him, their boots striking bone and muscle until he collapsed into the snow. They did not stop. They bound him tight in heavy cloth, the fabric rough against his skin, effectively silencing his resistance. They hauled the bundle toward the riverbank, the snow crunching rhythmically beneath their feet. The Neva River lay ahead, a vast, frozen expanse. They reached a jagged hole cut into the ice, the black water churning. With a final, collective heave, they shoved the bound form over the edge. There was a sharp splash, a brief ripple. They believed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. The river ice cracked, but the story did not end in the water. It began decades earlier, in the year 1869, in the remote Siberian village of Pokrovskoye. The wind here cut through wood and bone with equal indifference. In this frozen expanse, a child grew into a man who was an outcast from his first breath. His name, Rasputin, carried a weight that villagers whispered behind locked doors. It meant the debauched one. He did not walk with the gait of a laborer, nor did he speak with the humility of a peasant. He moved with a strange, heavy stillness. When he looked at a person, he did not glance away. He held his gaze, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed with a intensity that forced men to look at the dirt beneath their feet. Mothers pulled their children inside when he passed the threshold of their homes. They feared the way he seemed to see through the walls, through the skin, into the secrets they kept buried. He was a shadow in the village, a presence that made the air feel thin and sharp. He was not one of them, and he never would be. The village was a cage, and the man inside was already looking for a way to break the bars. In 1897, the village of Pokrovskoye became a memory. Rasputin left his family in the dead of night, stepping onto the dirt road that stretched toward the horizon. He walked for hundreds of miles, his boots wearing thin against the jagged Siberian terrain. He survived on scraps offered by strangers, and the water he found in mountain streams. When he reached the monastery, he was no longer the man who had left the village. He emerged as a starets, a wandering holy man claiming to speak with the divine. He carried no possessions, only a staff and a heavy, unwashed presence that seemed to precede him. By 1903, the long road ended at the iron gates of St. Petersburg. He stood before the city, a wild figure with matted hair and a gaze that cut through the noise of the capital. The city elite, hungry for the occult and bored with their own decadence, noticed him immediately. They saw the dirt on his hands and the fire in his eyes. They were drawn to him like moths to a flame, sensing a power that defied their logic. He walked into the heart of the empire, and the city began to lean in, waiting for him to speak. The gilded doors of the palace opened, and the air inside changed. It was a space of heavy velvet, polished marble, and the suffocating scent of incense. In 1905, Rasputin crossed the threshold into the inner sanctum of the Romanovs. The court was a place where the elite whispered of spirits and sought secrets in the shadows, and they found in him a living conduit to the unknown. He stood before Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, a stark, jagged silhouette against the refined elegance of the throne room. The Tsar watched him with a measured, weary curiosity, while the Empress leaned forward, her eyes searching his face for answers to questions she dared not voice. He did not bow with the practiced grace of a courtier. He stood rooted to the floor, his presence heavy and demanding. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The polite, measured conversations of the nobility died away, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. He held the attention of the two most powerful people in Russia, and as he began to speak, the court fell into a trance, drawn into the dark, magnetic pull of his gaze. The nursery was silent, save for the ragged, shallow breathing of Crown Prince Alexei. He lay motionless, his body failing under the weight of an internal hemorrhage. The doctors stood back, their faces pale, their hands empty of solutions. The Empress paced the room, her gaze fixed on her son as the life drained from him. Then, Rasputin entered. He did not look at the medical charts or the frantic specialists. He walked to the bedside. He placed his heavy, calloused hands over the boy and began to pray. His voice was a low, rhythmic drone that filled the room. He turned to the doctors and commanded them to stop the aspirin. He insisted the medicine was feeding the sickness, not curing it. The physicians protested, but the Empress silenced them with a single, sharp gesture. She watched, breath held, as the minutes stretched into an hour. Slowly, the internal bleeding ceased. The boy's color returned, his pulse steadied, and the immediate threat of death vanished. Empress Alexandra stood by the bed, her eyes fixed on the peasant. In that moment, her doubt dissolved. She saw a savior. World War I tore across the borders, and the Tsar departed for the front lines, leaving the capital behind. In his absence, the power vacuum did not remain empty. Rasputin stepped into the void. He began appointing ministers, dismissing critics, and dictating state policy from his private quarters. He held the levers of government while the nation bled on the battlefield. Outside the palace walls, the city changed. Bread lines stretched for blocks in the freezing cold, and the people grew desperate. Rumors began to circulate through the streets like a contagion. They whispered of an affair between the peasant and the Empress, a scandal that turned the public against the crown. The nobility watched in silence as the man they despised tightened his grip on the state. The monarchy was no longer seen as a divine institution, but as a compromised vessel. The rot was no longer hidden. It was the defining feature of the Romanov rule. The walls of the capital felt smaller every day. Rasputin knew the nobility was sharpening its knives. He did not flee. Instead, he sat at his desk, dipped a pen into ink, and began to write a final message to Tsar Nicholas. His hand moved with steady, deliberate strokes across the parchment. He did not ask for protection. He issued a cold, calculated ultimatum. He wrote that if commoners were to take his life, the throne would remain secure. But he warned that if it were the Tsar's own relations, the nobles and the princes who brought about his death, the consequences would be absolute. He predicted that none of the Romanov family would remain alive for more than 2 years. He folded the paper, pressed his seal into the wax, and left the letter where it would be found. The ink dried, but the words hung in the air like a death sentence. He had tied his own survival to the existence of the dynasty itself. The warning was not a plea for mercy. It was a map of the coming catastrophe. Every word was a stone laid on the path toward the end of the monarchy. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the weight of a future that was already written. the prophecy did not wait. In July 1918, the world turned cold in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The Romanov family, once masters of an empire, stood in the cramped, damp space. They were told they were being moved for their own safety, but the heavy thud of the door locking behind them told a different story. The air smelled of lime and stagnant dust. Outside, the revolution had already claimed the streets, but here, in the dark, the end was precise and mechanical. The guards entered, their faces tight, their weapons raised. There was no trial, no final words, only the sudden, deafening roar of gunfire. Smoke filled the room, thick and acrid, obscuring the walls. Bodies fell, one by one, hitting the floor in a tangle of limbs. The 300-year dynasty that had spanned centuries, survived wars, and commanded millions, vanished in a few minutes of chaos. The prophecy had been fulfilled with terrifying accuracy. The Romanovs were gone, and the throne was left empty. For decades, the world accepted the narrative of a man who refused to die. The story of the poisoned cakes that failed to kill, the bullets that only enraged, and the iron-willed survival of a peasant became the stuff of dark folklore. But in 2004, the legend met the scrutiny of modern science. Forensic experts revisited the details of that night in the Moika Palace. They looked past the dramatic accounts written by the conspirators themselves. The results were stark. The chemical analysis of the evidence showed no trace of the massive doses of cyanide Yusupov claimed to have used. The myth of the poison was a fabrication, a narrative tool designed to inflate the difficulty of the task. The autopsy findings confirmed a far more mundane and brutal truth. Rasputin did not survive the poison or the initial shots. He died from a single, precise bullet to the forehead. Yusupov had spun a tale of mystical endurance to mask his own incompetence and fear. The legend of the immortal monk was merely a mask. The death of Rasputin was meant to be a surgical strike to save the monarchy. Instead, it acted as a detonator. The conspirators had hoped to remove the shadow behind the throne, but they only succeeded in stripping away the last veil of imperial authority. News of the murder tore through St. Petersburg, not as a victory, but as a final, desperate admission of weakness. The people saw the elite turning on their own, and the illusion of divine rule dissolved. Within weeks, the streets were no longer silent. Bread riots turned into organized defiance. The factories shuttered and the workers flooded the squares, their voices rising in a singular, deafening roar. The monarchy, already hollowed out by war and mismanagement, found itself unable to hold the line. The assassination had not restored order. It had invited total chaos. By the time the spring thaw reached the Neva, the old world was already dead. The revolution did not just happen. It was unleashed by the very men who thought they could control the tide. The 300-year dynasty did not fall to a foreign army, but to the weight of its own internal rot, accelerated by a single, fatal act of violence. The prophecy Rasputin scribbled before his death proved terrifyingly accurate. In July 1918, the Romanov family faced their end in a basement in Yekaterinburg, fulfilling the warning that none of the Tsar's blood would survive him. The monarchy vanished, replaced by a new, brutal order that would redefine the 20th century. It is the ultimate irony of history. The peasant from the Siberian wilderness, once an outcast, became the fulcrum upon which an entire empire tilted and fell. He did not save the Tsar, nor did he save Russia. Instead, he left a vacuum that swallowed the old world whole. The void he created was not filled by the stability the conspirators craved, but by the fire of a revolution that changed the course of human events forever. Today, the Moika Palace remains, but the power that once emanated from that table in 1916 is gone, leaving only the cold wind off the Neva. The man who walked hundreds of miles to find God in a monastery ended as the catalyst for a godless state. History is rarely shaped by the grand designs of kings. It is often carved by the shadows of those they underestimate. The peasant from Pokrovskoye did not just witness the end of an era, he ensured it.